My name is Kent, and I'm 54 years old. Right now, I'm sitting in my living room staring at what was supposed to be the happiest photo of my son's life, his wedding picture. But every time I look at it, I feel this mix of pride and pain that's hard to describe. You see, there are moments in life when you realize you've been completely wrong about someone for over a year. Moments that change everything you thought you knew about family loyalty and what it really means to have class. Before I tell you about the most memorable and terrible day of my life as a father, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories. Trust me, you'll want to stay until the end of this one because what happened next will leave you speechless. Let me paint you a picture of who I am because it matters for what comes next. I've been an electrician for 30 years here in Denver, Colorado. I get up at 5 every morning, put on my work boots, and head out to fix what's broken. It's honest work, and I'm proud of it. My hands are rough, my back aches most days, and my pickup truck has seen better years. But I've never missed a day's work in 3 decades. 8 years ago, I lost my wife, Sarah, to cancer. She was everything to me, and when she passed, I thought my world had ended. But I had Marcus to think about. He was only 16 then, and losing his mother nearly broke him. So I did what any father would do. I worked harder. I picked up weekend jobs, holiday shifts, anything to keep us afloat and make sure he could still go to college like his mother always dreamed. Marcus is 28 now, and he's everything Sarah and I hoped he'd become. He's a software engineer, smart as a whip, making more in a year than I make in 3. But he's never forgotten where he came from. He still calls me every Sunday, still comes over to help fix things around the house, still hugs his old man like he did when he was little. That boy is my pride and joy, and I'd do anything for him. That's why when he told me he was in love, I was thrilled. He'd been alone too long, buried in his work, and I worried he'd end up like me, rattling around an empty house with nothing but memories. He met her on some dating app, he said. Her name was Amanda, and from the way his eyes lit up when he talked about her, I knew this was serious. The first time I met Amanda was at some fancy steakhouse downtown that she picked. I'd never eaten anywhere that required a reservation 2 weeks in advance, but Marcus insisted we do it her way. I put on my Sunday best, which admittedly wasn't much, and drove my old Ford pickup to the valet parking. The kid who took my keys looked at my truck like it might contaminate the Porsches and Mercedes surrounding it. Amanda was beautiful, I'll give her that. 26 years old with perfect blonde hair and clothes that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. She smiled and shook my hand, but I could see her eyes taking inventory of my slightly too short pants and the calluses on my palm. We made it through dinner, but I left feeling like I'd failed some test I didn't even know I was taking. Over the next few months, I tried to connect with her. I really did. But every conversation felt like walking through a minefield. She'd mentioned vacations to places I'd never heard of, designer brands that meant nothing to me, and people with job titles that sounded made up. When I talked about work or fishing or the Broncos, her eyes would glaze over like I was speaking a foreign language. But Marcus was happy, and that's all that mattered to me. If this girl made my son smile the way he did when he talked about her, then I'd find a way to make it work. I had to. About 6 months into their relationship, Marcus came to me with news that made my heart sink and soar at the same time. He was going to propose. He'd been saving up for months, working overtime, skipping meals to afford the kind of ring Amanda deserved. The ring cost more than my truck was worth, but seeing my son's excitement made every penny feel worthwhile. When Amanda said yes, she immediately started planning what she called their dream wedding. And let me tell you, this wasn't any small church ceremony with cake and punch in the fellowship hall. We're talking about a full weekend at the Rocky Mountain Resort, the kind of place where movie stars get married. The initial estimate was $80,000. $80,000. I made that much in 2 years. Marcus tried to scale it back, suggested maybe something smaller, but Amanda wouldn't hear it. She said this was her special day, that she'd dreamed of this wedding since she was a little girl, and that they couldn't start their marriage with compromises. So Marcus went to the bank and took out a loan, a big one. When he told me, I offered to help to contribute what I could from my savings, but Amanda quickly shut that down. She said they needed to do this themselves as a couple, and that outside help would make it feel less authentic. That should have been my first red flag, but I missed it completely. The guest list was another eye-opener. Amanda's side had over 200 names, colleagues from her marketing firm, friends from college, family from California, and what seemed like half of Denver's social elite. My side had 32 people, my brother and his wife, a handful of guys from work, Sarah's sister and her family, and some neighbors who'd watched Marcus grow up. Looking at those two lists side by side made me feel smaller than I had in years. But the real red flags started appearing about 3 months before the wedding. I was at Home Depot one Saturday morning when I saw Amanda in the parking lot and she was crying. Not the elegant tears you see in movies, but the ugly, desperate kind that comes from real panic. She was on her phone pacing back and forth next to a BMW that I'd never seen before, shouting about payments and deadlines and threatening to call lawyers. When she saw me, she quickly ended the call and wiped her face, said she was dealing with a difficult client, that working in high-end marketing meant dealing with demanding people. But something about her explanation didn't sit right. I'd been around enough people in crisis to recognize it when I saw it. Then there was the incident at the coffee shop. I'd stopped in for my usual black coffee when I overheard a conversation that made me freeze. A young woman was talking to the barista about her coworker Amanda, who'd called in sick again, and how someone named Amanda Hartley was about to get fired for missing too many shifts. The description matched Marcus's Amanda perfectly, but Marcus had told me she was a marketing executive at some high-end fashion company. Marketing executives don't call in sick to coffee shops. The BMW disappearance was the final straw. I'd been driving past Amanda's supposed penthouse building one evening when I saw her car being loaded onto a tow truck. The driver was arguing with her about missed payments. The next day, when Marcus mentioned that Amanda's car was in the shop for routine maintenance, I knew something was very wrong. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I called Jimmy Rodriguez, an old friend from high school who'd become a private investigator. I felt terrible doing it, like I was betraying my son's trust, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this woman was hiding something important, something that could hurt Marcus in ways I couldn't even imagine. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, the kind of perfect October day that makes you believe in fairy tales. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror adjusting the tie on my 15-year-old suit. It was the same suit I'd worn to Sarah's funeral, the only formal wear I owned, and I'd had it cleaned and pressed for the occasion. Looking at myself, I felt every one of my 54 years and then some. Marcus had stayed at the resort the night before with his groomsmen, so I drove alone through the winding mountain roads to what would become the most important day of my life. The resort was spectacular, all stone and timber nestled against the backdrop of snow-capped peaks. Valet attendants in crisp white shirts directed traffic, and I watched them expertly park Teslas and Audis while I sat in my pickup truck engine ticking as it cooled. The parking lot told the whole story. Luxury cars as far as the eye could see, and then my 15-year-old Ford rust spots and all, sitting among them like a sore thumb. But I'd raised my chin, grabbed the small gift I'd wrapped myself, and walked into that resort like I belonged there. Because today wasn't about me. It was about Marcus, and I'd be damned if I let my insecurities spoil his happiness. I found Marcus in the groom's suite surrounded by his college friends, who were all dressed in matching gray tuxedos that probably cost more than my monthly salary. When he saw me, his whole face lit up, and he crossed the room in 3 quick strides to wrap me in a bear hug that reminded me of when he was 8 years old and I'd come home from a long day of work. "Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe this day is actually here. I keep thinking Mom should be here to see this." I had to clear my throat before I could respond. "She is here, son. She's watching and she's proud of the man you've become, just like I am." We stood there for a moment, father and son, surrounded by silk ties and cufflinks and the nervous energy of a wedding morning. In that instant, I almost told him everything, about Jimmy's investigation, about what I'd discovered about the folder of documents sitting in my truck. But looking at his radiant face, I couldn't do it. This was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. The ceremony itself was everything Amanda had dreamed of. The chapel was decorated with white roses and baby's breath with ribbons and candles, creating an atmosphere that belonged on the cover of a wedding magazine. I sat in the front row, watching my son stand at the altar in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, looking more handsome and grown up than I'd ever seen him. When Amanda walked down the aisle in her $15,000 gown, I had to admit she looked like a princess. Her dress sparkled with what I assumed were diamonds, though Jimmy's investigation had taught me to question everything I saw. She carried herself with perfect poise, smiling at the guests like she was born for this moment, which in a way, I guess she was. The ceremony was flawless. They exchanged vows they'd written themselves, Marcus speaking about finding his soulmate, and Amanda talking about how love had transformed her life. When they kissed and the congregation erupted in applause, I found myself clapping along despite everything I knew. For that moment, I let myself believe in the fairy tale. But fairy tales, as I was about to learn, don't always have happy endings. The reception was held in the resort's grand ballroom, a cavernous space with crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the mountain valley. Round tables covered in crisp white linens filled the room, each one decorated with centerpieces that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. I was seated at table 12, along with my brother Dave and his wife Linda, and a few other relatives who looked just as out of place as I felt. Amanda's guests filled the front tables near the head table. They were exactly what I'd expected: perfectly groomed men in expensive suits discussing stock portfolios, and women whose jewelry caught the light every time they gestured. Their conversations drifted over to our table in fragments. Vacation homes in Aspen, private schools for their children, business deals involving numbers that made my head spin. I tried to make conversation with the couple seated next to me, but when they asked what I did for a living and I mentioned being an electrician, the conversation died faster than a blown fuse. They suddenly became very interested in their salads, and I went back to watching my son, who looked happier than I'd ever seen him. The evening progressed with all the traditional wedding elements. The first dance, where Marcus and Amanda moved across the floor like they were floating. The father-daughter dance, which Amanda performed alone since her parents had supposedly been unable to attend due to a last-minute business emergency. I thought it was strange that business would keep parents from their daughter's wedding, but I kept my thoughts to myself. Then came the speeches. The best man told funny stories about Marcus in college. The maid of honor shared tales of late-night phone calls and girl talk. Each speech was polished and perfect, delivered by people who clearly had experience speaking at events like this. I started to feel grateful that I hadn't been asked to speak. What would I have said? How would my rough electrician's voice have sounded in this room full of educated, sophisticated people? But then Amanda stood up, her champagne glass catching the light from the chandelier above. The room fell silent as she tapped her fork against the crystal, the gentle ringing calling everyone to attention. She looked radiant, confident, every inch the perfect bride. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the ballroom. "This has been the most magical day of my life, and I want to thank everyone who made it possible." She went through her list systematically. Her bridesmaids, the wedding planner, the resort staff, the photographer, each acknowledgement was gracious and heartfelt. Then she turned to family. "I want to thank my husband's family for welcoming me," she continued, and I felt myself straightening in my chair, preparing for what I hoped would be a kind word. "And to Kent, Marcus's father, who, despite being, let's say, from a different social background, has tried his best. I know it must be hard for someone of your class, but to see your son marry up like this." The words hit me like a physical blow. The entire ballroom went silent, not the comfortable quiet of people listening to a speech, but the awful silence of witnesses to a car crash. 250 people suddenly became very interested in their champagne glasses, their napkins, anything but looking at the older man in the 15-year-old suit who'd just been publicly humiliated by his son's new wife. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, felt the familiar sting of tears behind my eyes that I hadn't experienced since Sarah's funeral. But this wasn't grief. This was rage, pure and simple. This was the accumulated weight of every condescending look, every interrupted conversation, every moment over the past 18 months when I'd been made to feel like I wasn't good enough for this family my son was marrying into. Marcus looked stricken, his face cycling through confusion, embarrassment, and growing anger. He started to stand to say something, but it was too late. The damage was done. In 30 seconds, this woman had reduced me to nothing more than an embarrassing reminder of my son's humble beginnings. But as I sat there feeling the stares of 250 people, something unexpected happened. Instead of shrinking into my chair, instead of leaving quietly like everyone expected, I felt a calm settle over me. Because in my truck parked between all those luxury cars was a folder that contained information that would change this entire evening. Information that would expose exactly who Amanda really was and what kind of class she actually came from. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the polished floor, and every eye in the room turned to me. Most people probably expected me to excuse myself to leave quietly so the celebration could continue without the awkward reminder of different social backgrounds. Instead, I started walking toward the front of the room. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the silent ballroom, I have a few words I'd like to share as well. The walk to the front of the ballroom felt like it took forever, and no time at all. I was aware of every eye following my movement, every whispered speculation about what the embarrassed father might do next. Some guests looked sympathetic, others appeared uncomfortable, and a few seemed almost excited by the drama unfolding before them. Marcus was half standing at the head table, confusion and concern written across his face, while Amanda had gone very pale despite her perfect makeup. I reached the microphone and adjusted it down to my height. For a moment I just stood there looking out at all these perfectly dressed people in their perfectly arranged evening. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, and I could see some guests shifting in their seats, wondering if I was about to break down completely. "Thank you, Amanda," I finally said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "That was very illuminating. I appreciate you bringing up the subject of social backgrounds and class differences. You're absolutely right that we should be honest about where we come from." I paused, letting that sink in while I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the folder I'd retrieved from my truck during the cocktail hour. Jimmy had done thorough work, and the weight of those papers felt substantial in my hands. "You know, I've spent the last few months learning quite a bit about backgrounds myself." I continued opening the folder with deliberate care. "And I think this is the perfect time to share some of that information with everyone here. After all, if we're talking about honesty in class, shouldn't we all be completely transparent?" Amanda's face had gone from pale to ashen. She was gripping her champagne glass so tightly I was afraid it might shatter. Marcus was now fully standing, his confusion giving way to a dawning realization that something much bigger was happening than anyone had expected. "Let's start with careers," I said, pulling out the first document. "Amanda, you've told everyone here tonight and for the past 18 months that you work as a marketing executive at Crawford & Associates Fashion Marketing. That's quite impressive, isn't it? Executive level at such a young age." The guests murmured agreement. Several of Amanda's supposed colleagues nodded knowingly, as if they'd heard this story many times before. "The only problem," I continued, "is that Crawford & Associates has never heard of you. In fact, according to their HR department, you've never even applied for a position there." The murmur in the room changed tone, becoming sharper, more focused. I saw several guests lean forward in their chairs. "But you do have a job," I said, consulting my papers. "Amanda Rose Hartley, employee number 47291 at the Target store on Colfax Avenue, part-time sales associate in the women's clothing department, current hourly wage $14.50, total annual income last year $28,437. The silence that followed was deafening. Someone's fork clattered against their plate. In the back of the room, I saw one of Amanda's supposed colleagues quietly push back from his table and head for the exit. Amanda found her voice finally. That's not true. This is ridiculous. Marcus, you can't believe." But I wasn't finished. I pulled out another document, this one with photos attached. "Now let's talk about housing," I said. "Everyone here has heard about Amanda's penthouse downtown. Very impressive address, very exclusive building. The kind of place that screams success and sophistication." I held up one of Jimmy's photographs. "This is Amanda's actual address, 2T847 Morrison Street, apartment 3B. A 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom unit that she shares with 3 roommates. Monthly rent per person, $375. The building was constructed in 1967 and was last renovated sometime during the Reagan administration." The atmosphere in the ballroom had completely transformed. What had started as an elegant wedding reception was now feeling more like a courtroom drama, with me as the prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury of Amanda's peers. I could see the shift in people's expressions, the way their polite interest was becoming something sharper and more judgmental. "But wait," I continued, warming to my task now. "There's more. Let's discuss family background, since that seems to be such an important topic tonight." I pulled out another set of documents, feeling like a magician with an endless supply of rabbits. Amanda has told everyone that her parents are successful business owners in California, too busy with their enterprises to attend their daughter's wedding. Robert and Linda Hartley, entrepreneurs who built their fortune from the ground up. The lie was so elaborate, so detailed, that for a moment I almost felt sorry for Amanda. Almost. "The truth is somewhat different," I said. "Robert Hartley works the day shift at a 7-Eleven in Riverside, California. He's been there for 11 years, makes about $32,000 a year, and his biggest business decision is whether to order extra hot dogs for the weekend rush. Linda Hartley works at a nail salon called Pretty Fingers, where she's been doing manicures for the past 8 years. I looked directly at Amanda now. She had stopped trying to interrupt and was just staring at me with a mixture of hatred and terror. They didn't miss this wedding because of business, I continued. They missed it because they couldn't afford the plane tickets, because their daughter told them the wedding was small and intimate and that she'd visit them during the holidays instead. Because Amanda was embarrassed by her parents' real jobs and real income. Marcus was now looking at his new wife like he'd never seen her before. The confusion on his face was heartbreaking, but I couldn't stop now. There was too much truth that needed to come out. "Shall we continue?" I asked. "Let's talk about that BMW you've all seen Amanda driving. Beautiful car, really sends a message about success and taste." I held up another document. It's a lease-to-own agreement that Amanda defaulted on 3 months ago. The car was repossessed on September 15th, which explains why it was suddenly in the shop for such a long maintenance period. The replacement car she's been driving belongs to one of her roommates, a 2018 Honda Civic with a cracked windshield and a tendency to overheat in traffic. Someone in the back of the room actually gasped. I was starting to feel like I was dismantling a house of cards, watching each carefully constructed lie collapse under the weight of simple truth. The designer clothes, the expensive jewelry, the lavish lifestyle, I continued, all of it financed through a network of credit cards that are now maxed out and in default. Amanda owes approximately $47,000 to various creditors, not including the loans she took out to help pay for this wedding. Amanda finally exploded. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. "Just stop! Why are you doing this? This is my wedding day." The mask had finally slipped completely. The poised, sophisticated woman was gone, replaced by someone who looked very young and very scared. But I wasn't done yet. There was one more revelation, the biggest one of all. "But here's the most important thing," I said, my voice growing quieter, forcing everyone to lean in to hear. "Amanda didn't plan to stop the deception after the wedding. She planned to escalate it." I pulled out the final document, a loan application that Jimmy had somehow managed to obtain. This is an application for a home equity loan in the amount of $200,000 to be secured against my son's house. An application that was submitted 3 weeks ago with Amanda listed as Marcus's wife and co-applicant. The intended use of funds to pay off existing debts and, quote, provide seed money for various investment opportunities, unquote. Marcus sat down heavily like someone had cut his strings. The implications were hitting him now. This wasn't just about lying to impress people. This was about money. This was about using him. "You see," I said, looking out at all the faces staring back at me, when Amanda talked about class and social backgrounds, she was right about one thing. There are differences between people. But those differences aren't about how much money your parents make or what kind of car you drive or whether you shop at Target or Neiman Marcus. I folded up the documents and put them back in the folder. The real difference is between people who are honest about who they are and people who build their entire lives on lies, between people who work hard for what they have and people who think they deserve things they haven't earned, between people who treat others with respect and people who think they can buy their way into a better class of human being. The ballroom was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning humming in the background. Amanda was crying now, her perfect makeup streaking down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of anger and humiliation and fear about what would happen next. What happened next was chaos, but it was the kind of slow-motion chaos you see in movies, where everything falls apart with a horrible inevitability. Amanda's carefully constructed world didn't just collapse, it imploded spectacularly, taking the fairy tale wedding with it. Amanda stood up so quickly her chair fell backward with a crash that echoed through the silent ballroom. "Fine," she screamed, her voice breaking with emotion. "You want the truth?" "Yes, it's all true, every word of it. But I love Marcus, I really do love him." She turned to face Marcus, her wedding dress rustling as she moved mascara creating dark tracks down her cheeks. "I didn't want to be poor anymore, Marcus. I didn't want to live in that apartment with those girls forever. I didn't want to worry about whether I could afford groceries or if my parents would lose their house. I wanted a better life and you could give me that." "Is that so wrong?" Marcus was staring at her like she was a stranger, which in many ways she was. The woman he'd fallen in love with had been as fictional as a character in a novel. He opened his mouth to speak several times, but no words came out. What do you say when you discover your entire relationship has been built on a foundation of lies? Amanda? He finally managed, his voice barely audible. I don't care that your parents work regular jobs. I don't care that you work at Target. I would have loved you anyway. But this, he gestured at the chaos around them. What you just did to my father, what you've been doing to me for 18 months, I don't even know who you are. The guests were beginning to stir now, the spell of shocked silence breaking as people started to process what they'd witnessed. Some were already standing gathering purses and jackets, murmuring apologies about early flights and babysitter schedules. Others remained frozen in their seats, apparently unable to tear themselves away from the drama unfolding before them. Amanda's supposed friends and colleagues were notably absent from the concerned faces looking in her direction. The people she'd surrounded herself with, the ones who'd validated her fictional lifestyle, were melting away like snow in spring. I realized that many of them might have been as fake as everything else about her life. Marcus, please, Amanda pleaded, reaching for his hand. We can work through this. We can start over. I'll be honest from now on, I promise. I just wanted to be worthy of you. But Marcus stepped back, avoiding her touch. Worthy, he repeated, his voice growing stronger. Amanda, my mother cleaned houses to help pay for my college tuition. My father worked 3 jobs so I could have decent clothes for school. They taught me that worth comes from character, not bank accounts. You are already worthy just by being yourself. You just never gave me the chance to love the real you. That's when Amanda turned on me, her grief transforming into rage. This is all your fault, she spat. You never liked me. You never gave me a chance. You were just waiting for an opportunity to ruin my happiness. I felt the old familiar ache in my chest, the one that came whenever someone questioned my motivations as a father. But I'd had 30 years of practice dealing with difficult situations, and this wasn't going to break me. You're wrong, Amanda, I said quietly. I spent 18 months hoping I was wrong about you. I wanted to like you because Marcus loved you. I would have welcomed you into our family with open arms if you'd just been honest. My wife came from a family with no money just like yours. The difference is, she never pretended to be anything other than what she was, and I loved her more for it, not less. The final guests were filing out now, some pausing to shake my hand or whisper words of support, others leaving quickly to avoid any further awkwardness. The resort staff was hovering at the edges of the room, clearly unsure whether to start cleaning up or wait for some kind of official end to the evening. Marcus walked over to me, his formal posture finally cracking. When he put his arms around me, I felt him shaking. Dad, he whispered, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry about what she said to you about all of this. You were protecting me, weren't you? You've known for a while. I nodded against his shoulder. I hired an investigator 3 months ago. I kept hoping she'd tell you the truth herself, but she was in too deep. And tonight when I couldn't finish the sentence. The memory of her public humiliation was still too fresh. You saved me, Dad, he said. I can't believe I was so blind. She took out loans in my name, didn't she? That's how she paid for all this. I nodded again. There would be time to deal with the financial mess later. Right now, my son needed to know that he was loved and that this disaster wasn't his fault. Amanda was still standing by the head table alone now, except for one bridesmaid who seemed torn between loyalty and self-preservation. The room that had been filled with celebration an hour ago now felt like the aftermath of a battle with overturned chairs and abandoned champagne glasses bearing witness to the destruction of a carefully planned deception. The weeks that followed Amanda's wedding disaster were among the strangest of my life. Marcus moved back into his old bedroom, something I never thought would happen again after he'd bought his own house. At first, we moved around each other carefully, like survivors of the same accident who weren't sure how to process what they'd experienced together. The legal aftermath was complicated and expensive. Amanda had indeed forged Marcus's signature on several loan documents, and untangling that mess required lawyers and paperwork and more money than either of us wanted to spend. But Jimmy Rodriguez, who'd done such thorough investigative work, recommended a good attorney who specialized in fraud cases, and eventually we got most of it sorted out. Marcus threw himself into work with the kind of desperate intensity people use to avoid thinking about painful subjects. He'd leave the house before dawn and come home after dark speaking in single syllables and picking at the dinners I cooked for us. I recognized the behavior because I'd done the same thing after Sarah died, using exhaustion as a shield against emotions that felt too big to handle. About 3 weeks after the wedding that wasn't Marcus finally broke down. I found him in the living room at 2 in the morning, still in his work clothes, staring at the blank television screen with tears streaming down his face. "I feel so stupid, Dad," he said when he realized I was there. "How could I not see it? How could I be so completely wrong about someone I thought I loved?" I sat down beside him on the couch, the same couch where I'd comforted him after his mother died, and tried to find the right words. "You weren't stupid," I told him. "You were trusting. There's a difference. Amanda created a character designed specifically to appeal to you. She studied you, figured out what you wanted in a partner, and then became that person. You can't blame yourself for falling in love with someone who was trying very hard to be lovable." "But the signs were there," he insisted. "The things that didn't add up, the stories that changed. I ignored them because I wanted to believe in the fairy tale." That's when I told him about the conversation I'd had with his mother near the end when the cancer was winning, and we both knew it. She'd made me promise that if Marcus ever found himself in trouble, if he ever needed protecting, I wouldn't hesitate to do whatever was necessary, even if it meant being the bad guy. "She was worried about you being too trusting," I explained. "She said you had a good heart, and that people with good hearts sometimes can't see the darkness in others because it's so foreign to their own nature. She made me promise to watch out for people who might take advantage of that goodness." Marcus was quiet for a long time after that, processing the idea that his mother had somehow anticipated this situation and prepared for it even from beyond the grave. "Do you think I'll ever be able to trust anyone again?" he asked eventually. "I think you'll be more careful," I said. "But I hope you don't stop trusting altogether. The world needs people like you, people who believe in the best of others. You just need to learn to balance that optimism with a little healthy skepticism." We started spending more time together after that conversation. Marcus would come home at reasonable hours and we'd work on projects around the house. We painted the kitchen, fixed the fence, and rebuilt the engine in my old pickup truck. It was good therapy for both of us, using our hands to create something positive after feeling so helpless during the Amanda crisis. I never did find out what happened to Amanda after that night. Marcus said she'd sent him a few desperate text messages in the days immediately following the wedding, alternately apologizing and blaming everyone else for the disaster, but he'd blocked her number, and eventually the messages stopped coming. Sometimes I wondered if I'd been too harsh, if there might have been a gentler way to handle the situation. But then I'd remember the look on her face when she'd called me low class, the calculated cruelty in her voice, and I knew I'd made the right choice. Some people might call what I did revenge, but I called it protection. I was protecting my son from a life built on lies, and I was protecting myself from a lifetime of being treated like something shameful that needed to be hidden away. Marcus started dating again about 6 months later, but this time things were different. He was more careful, more observant, more willing to take things slowly. When he introduced me to Sarah, a kindergarten teacher from Nebraska whose parents were farmers, I knew immediately that this was different. She wore jeans and sneakers to dinner, asked intelligent questions about electrical work, and when she laughed at my terrible jokes, it was genuine. The contrast couldn't have been more striking. Where Amanda had been performance art, Sarah was authenticity. Where Amanda had been all surface glamour, Sarah had depth and substance. And when Marcus looked at Sarah, I saw something I'd never seen during the Amanda years: peace. But the real test came 6 months into their relationship, when Sarah came to Sunday dinner and helped me wash dishes afterward. As we stood in my modest kitchen drying plates that had belonged to Marcus's mother, she said something that took my breath away. "Mr. Kent," she said, "Marcus has told me all about what happened with his first engagement. I want you to know that I think what you did took tremendous courage. It must have been terrifying to risk your relationship with your son to protect him from making a terrible mistake." I had to stop drying the plate in my hands because my eyes were suddenly blurry with tears. "I also want you to know," she continued, "that I'm grateful Marcus has a father who loves him enough to be the bad guy when necessary. That's the kind of grandfather I'd want my children to have someday." That night, after Sarah had gone home and Marcus was upstairs, I sat in my living room looking at the photos on the mantel. Pictures of Sarah and me on our wedding day. Pictures of Marcus growing up. Pictures of the three of us during the good years before cancer stole our perfect little family. I realized that what I'd learned from the Amanda experience wasn't just about protecting Marcus. It was about understanding what real class actually means. It's not about money or possessions or social status. It's about how you treat people, especially people who can't do anything for you. It's about being honest about who you are and where you come from. It's about having the courage to do the right thing even when it's difficult or unpopular. Amanda had called me low class, and maybe by her definition I was. I'd never owned a luxury car or worn a designer suit or vacationed in exotic locations. I'd never had business cards with impressive titles or belonged to exclusive clubs or invested in anything more sophisticated than my retirement account. But I'd raised a good man who knew the value of hard work and honest dealing. I'd kept my promises to my wife, even the hard ones. I'd protected my family when they needed protecting, regardless of the cost to myself. And in the end, I'd taught my son that real worth isn't about what you have, but about who you are when nobody's watching. If that made me low class in Amanda's world, then I was proud to be low class. Because true class isn't about rising above where you came from. It's about never forgetting where you came from and staying true to the values that got you where you are. Marcus found real love with Sarah, and they're planning a wedding for next spring. It'll be a small ceremony in the church where his mother and I were married, followed by a reception in the fellowship hall with cake and punch, and dancing to a DJ who charges by the hour instead of by the song. I couldn't be more proud. And Amanda? Well, I heard through Jimmy Rodriguez that she moved back to California shortly after our encounter. I hope she found some peace and learned something about the difference between wanting a better life and earning a better life. I hope she discovered that authenticity is more valuable than any designer label, and that the right person will love you for who you are, not who you pretend to be. But mostly I hope she learned what I've always known, that class isn't about money. It's about character. And character is something you can't fake, no matter how good your performance might be. Let me ask you something, and I really want you to think about this. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between keeping the peace and standing up for what's right, even when it meant being the bad guy? Have you ever had to protect someone you love from their own good nature? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because I think we've all been there in one way or another. And if this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own experiences with people who weren't what they seemed to be, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about the things that really matter. Share this with someone who needs to hear that sometimes being the bad guy is actually being the best father you can be. Thank you for listening to An Old Electrician's Story, and remember that real class never goes out of style. Take care of yourselves and the people you love, and I'll see you in the next one.